So welcome everybody. Hope it's not too late to say Happy New Year. This is the first MGHA New Books on Japan talk for this year. We have a great calendar of events that will be coming up throughout the rest of the winter and the spring. So I hope you can go on the website and check out some of the other amazing book talks that we'll be hosting in the coming months. But it's my privilege to welcome you all here to attend this presentation by Professor Jung Lee about her amazing book, which I highly recommend. Of course, you'll hear a little bit more about it in a bit. But checking out, if you haven't already, getting a copy. Yes, Ian has his copy too. Renaming Plants and Nations in Japanese Colonial Korea. So by way of just introduction, I'm Joseph Seeley. I'll be moderating this event. I am professor of Korean Imperial Japan at history at the University of Virginia. And then our discussant today will be Professor Ian Miller from Harvard University. And just by way of introduction, Professor Miller is a historian of Japan and its modern empire. Research primarily focuses on the cultural dimensions of scientific, technological, and environmental change. And his first book, which many of us I'm sure are familiar with, Nature of the Beast, Empire and Exhibition at Tokyo Imperial Zoo, looks at East Asia's first modern zoological garden, the Tokyo Ueno Zoo, as a showcase of modernity, but also a way of reframing human and non-human relationships in Japan and its empire. He's working on a new book, Fueling Tokyo, Japan in the Age of Global Energy, and has also edited a number of volumes, including the recently published Oceanic Japan, which I see some of the authors from that, contributors from that volume also in the Zoom room. It is a really fantastic volume, so please check that out. And now I have the great privilege of introducing our presenter, Professor Lee. So Professor Jung Lee is an associate professor at Institute of Humanities at Ewha Women's University in Seoul, South Korea. She's a historian of science and technology. Originally received her degree in physics from Yonsei University and worked for many years as a systems engineer before embarking on a love of history of science and ultimately receiving, after studying in the United States and Korea, ultimately receiving a PhD in history of science and philosophy of science from Seoul National University. And she's done a number of prestigious postdocs and fellowships following that, places like the Needham Research Institute, the Academia Sinica in Taiwan, the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science in Berlin, and the Institute of Advanced Studies in Paris. So it's quite a globetrotter, which is great. She's published this book, which I'll introduce in a bit, as well as work on papermaking in Korea, and is now working on a new project on water engineering in the Korean Peninsula, historically. So really looking forward to this presentation. We'll go ahead and have her present, followed by Professor Miller's comments and a brief response from Professor Lee to those comments, and then we'll open it up for a broader Q&A.
Oh, so let me share the slide. Oh, thank you so much for that kind introduction, and thank you everyone for joining this event. It is my great privilege and pleasure to introduce my book, Renaming Plants and Nations in Japanese Colonial Korea, to the members of Modern Japan History Association. I cannot thank Joseph and Ian enough for generously taking up this job of moderation and discussion. It is my great honor and privilege to have them on the panel. First, as you can see, the book has 8 main chapters. It begins with the Japanese exploration in Joseon, Korea, and European exploration in Tokugawa, Japan, in the 18th century, and then moves to 20th century Japanese colonial Korea. It examines the practices and interactions of diverse groups of people who made themselves botanists. Those botanists, Shokubutsu gakusha in Japanese, 식물학자 in Korean, are Japanese professors in mainland Japan, Japanese settler officials and teachers in colonial Korea, Korean teachers, and a rare Lodai educated Korean professor in a colonial college. One of their goals was to practice Western modern science for their and their nation's enlightenment. with the hope that you may read the small book chapter by chapter someday, this talk mainly introduces its topic, methodological approaches, specific context, and questions. To give you some ideas of its various stories, I discussed the renaming of several plants: sakura, mugung flowers, taeyang willow, dengang tree, inkyo or icho tree. By discussing certain doubts involved in the renaming of these plants, I want to reflect on the contention about this historical transition called modernization. The promise to make progress by what is right in the names of enlightenment, civilization, and science. The rule of brute force was to be that of the past. But was it the deal? Prompted by many who have reflected on this question, I'd like you to rethink the whole thing with me, including the name of Western modern science throughout this strange talk. So what is this book about? Sorry. The topic of the book is not the entire botanical science, but mostly the science plant systematics with Japanese Colonial Korea as its main theater. To learn about interesting things going on in this theater, I chose certain approaches to follow things as they unfolded, as historians do, while making slight adjustments in perspective, all inspired by previous critiques. First, I thought it could be really all about cross-cultural interactions, since plant systematics, also called taxonomy and natural history, was a science quite begot by such cross-cultural interactions. It was those dried plant specimens in European herbaria in Leiden, Uppsala, Paris, London, and Berlin that the likes of Carl Linné and Joseph Banks had produced their natural systems to classify plants. Second, in shaping Japanese and Korean plant systematics in these cross-cultural interactions, these Japanese and Korean botanists to-be could not bring completed sets of knowledge and institutions from somewhere. They had to make them from the ground up. As Ian did so in describing the making of Tokyo's Ueno Zoo, I tried to follow all this in the making, seeing what's negotiated between the old and new ideas and things. Third, as revealed by this process of making schools, departments, professorships, academic societies for their transnational knowledge practice, I wanted to illuminate the inseparability of modern science and modern nation. They emerged and shaped in interaction through a constant negotiation involving tensions and confusions on both sides. Although both Japanese and Koreans sought to live as those free, modern individuals too, the charged interactions in the colonial settings left strong imprints on their knowledge practice too. Fourth, I tried to treat all plant systematics, not only Japanese and Korean, but also European, American, and Oceanian ones, more in symmetry. There has been no consensus about the universal or natural system of classification even within Europe. To make all in different societies differently resolve the confusions and challenges, grappling with the daunting task of finding the phylogenetic, that is, evolutionary relations of plants. Since few Linnes nor Banks chipped in for the making of Japanese or Korean institutions, Japanese and Korean botanists did all that required to build and shape their systematics, like their counterparts in other parts of the globe. It would be strange to treat one as that of transfer and the other as that of making. Fifth, I discussed not just well-known botanists with international standing, but many obscure Koreans and Japanese who called themselves botanists. They turned out to be scientists in their own right, with their own rules and principles, which were at times no less reasonable than those of the renowned botanists. They were hardly mere collectors, assistants, or informers for some one universal science. The specific context of plant systematics in Japanese colonial Korea shaped and helped these approaches. While classifying and naming plants sounds like an old science these days, it was quite cutting-edge big science at the time. By the promise from these emerging botanists, many emerging nations like Germany, Japan, and the US invested in it as a science that would usher in their nation's modernity. It had popular appeals too, exciting many natural history booms in many states, including Japan and colonial Korea. Japanese insecurity as a non-Western empire and Korean rivalry with Japan as a neighboring colony sharing too much history made these botanical interactions in Korea most intense and symmetric. The number of Koreans who thought they should do their own botany rather than just collecting for imperial botanists seems far greater than in any other colony. That it was a field science that could be done with modest equipment and facilities if they just studied local plants was also important, as other fields like physics and chemistry did not see a similar rise of colonial scientists. Hundreds of thousands of Japanese settlers in colonial Korea, although colonial Korea was not a full settler colony, created a unique dynamic. Japanese teachers cum botanists who wanted to make most of their long-term colonial residency in their pursuit of scientific lives more clearly challenged the vulnerable authority of Japanese imperial systematics to further embolden colonized Koreans. Compared to remote Western colonies with significant linguistic and cultural gaps, Korea's tradition, written in Chinese characters, quite accessible to Japanese settlers, also created particular tensions in colonial scientific interactions. Immersed in this specific context, this book follows how Japanese and Korean botanists simultaneously shaped their respective systematics. Yet they nonetheless promoted their own systematics as Western modern science, thus actualizing this entity ever in the making through their non-Western practices. So in this actor's term, I discuss Western modern science and show how this Western modern science has much fusion of Western, non-Western, imperial, colonial, scientific, political, theoretical, and practical, and traditional innovative elements, as many in the field have shown. Yet, as their name, Western modern science often shrouds those complex contents. I rather want us to think this question. What were, in the name of Western modern science, that these Japanese and Korean botanists evoked? As I will present several plants scientifically renamed by these botanists, you may see for yourself what were in those names. First case is those of sakura and mugung flowers. To be clear, it was very new to make this kind of dried plant specimens and classify and name plants in Latin binomial. This practice of observing and comparing objective details of plants through specimens indeed looks scientific, and it was a method first systematically pursued by Western botanists like Carl Linné. Linné is, of course, the father of systematics, who published his natural system since 1735. His natural system offered the hierarchical system, starting from kingdoms, animals, plants, minerals, to families, classes, orders, genera, and species. and established the binomial nomenclature, the two-part name for the genus and species name, followed by the name of the botanist. In establishing this natural system, Linné used various collections of dried specimens from all over the world, including those in Leiden, collected through the commercial network of Dutch East India Company, and his own collections in Sweden by his disciples dispatched to all continents, including China and Japan. He made specimens a powerful tool to bring nature into his lab for his influential system of classification. Yet, you may also notice that it is hard to tell what plants they are by looking at these specimens. They don't look like sakura or mugung flowers, which look like these photos. They became more identifiable by Latin descriptions detailing their characteristic features. For mugung flowers, it was indeed Linné who gave the scientific name Hibiscus syriacus. As capitalized L notes so. Linné named it in 1753 by a rose of Sharon in the garden of George Clifford, one of the directors of the Dutch East India Company. This scientific name wasn't challenged in Japanese colonial Korea, but the vernacular name of mugung, which literally means endless, was a renewed name given by colonized Koreans as a symbol of their endless resistance to Japanese imperialism. It became a national flower for a lost nation by this renaming, aided by some ancient texts. Sakura was renamed scientifically by Japanese botanist Matsumura Jinjo, a professor in botany at Tokyo Imperial University, as Prunus edoensis. He gave this Latin name to the most popular kind of cherry, Somei Yoshino, identifying it as a new species. It was a big cause of celebration for the Japanese botanical establishment. It was a much-awaited success, demonstrating Japanese botanists' ability to scientifically name Japanese plants. And this was the Japanese cherry, was the soul of Japan, that Japan came to transplant into its expanding colonial territories. What dampened this celebratory mood was a report by a German botanist who claimed its origin as a Korean island of Jeju. The soul of Japan originated not from Tokyo or Edo as we insist, but from a benighted colonial land. Yet most Japanese botanists seem more disconcerted by the possibility that it was a hybrid cultivar, not a natural species. It would cross the name as Prunus X edoensis out of the natural order of plants. As such naming for hybrid cultivar, like Somei Yoshino, had been done forever by various common unknown practitioners, it may fail to elevate Matsumura's naming as a science. One may assume that this naming reflects unique limitations of Japan's imitated modernity. Yet Linné's successful name of Hibiscus syriacus has similar stories, as it was also for a garden plant, and his suggestion for its origin, Syria as in Syriacus, was also mistaken. While it's a widely cultivated plant in the Middle East, as its English name suggests, its natural habitat exists only in Southeast Asia, China. These two cases of renaming show the entangled emergence of science and nation and the murky boundaries between natural and cultivated plants and scientific and common practices of naming. The next renamed plant is Seiyang willow. The botanist who renamed it is Nakai Takenoshin, a professor at Tokyo Imperial University. who finished his thesis on Korean flora in 1909 without ever visiting Korea, and became the guest botanist for the Government General of Korea from 1913. His 22 volumes of Flora Sylvatica Koreana made a resounding success in showing Japan's successful modernization of botany. As shown in his honorable selection for the International Committee on Botanical Nomenclature at the International Botanical Congress in 1926. Yet he renamed Seiyang willow twice, as he initially identified it as a known species of Salix florida when he first saw it in 1915 near the mountain Baekdu, the lively borderland depicted in Joseph's work. What led to his renaming was input from the colonial field, since Nakai mostly stayed at his Tokyo lab, making only brief visits to Korea during his summer vacations. He had many help for his remote botanizing. Many Japanese foresters settled in colonial forestry institutes were especially reliable. For this willow too, they informed Nakai of its unique characteristics that they discovered the next spring. Unlike other willows, it had small flowers called catkins. By their carefully collected specimen with a delicate catkin, Nakai could rename it as Salix splendida in 1918. Yet they further noticed what Nakai at his lab was unable to detect, its lack of scent. As having no scent made it rely on the wind for pollination, unlikely for the genus of Salix, they further pushed Nakai for reclassification. Thus came a new genus, Josephia splendida, which became a representative achievement of Nakai's classification in Korea. You will see all these different names written on the specimen at the Arnold Arboretum too. This repeated renaming of Seiyang willow, however, made Japanese settler experts question the internationally recognized authority of Nakai and Nakai's unfair acknowledgement of their contribution. The new names only honored Nakai, and Nakai treated them as mere collectors, obscuring their knowledgeable and crucial input. Apparently incorrecting such notions and demonstrating their contributions, one of settler experts even published a lengthy thesis on the classification of willow trees. This vocal critic, named Ishidoya Tsutomu, quite empowered settler Japanese and Korean botanists for crossing boundaries between lab and field and theory and practice, and to challenge Nakai's authority and do their own botanizing. One such emboldened Korean was Jung Tae-hyun, who had a one-year course at Suwon Agricultural School, but came to make his serious studies on Korean plants by working under Ishidoya Tsutomu at the Forest Research Lab. He was also an assistant to Nakai for his short summer trips in Korea. Jung's assistance to Nakai was first noted in Nakai's renaming of Dengang tree as Abelia Taeyeoni. Some interpreted this naming Taeyeoni and Nakai's note on Jung's help for this dedication as showing Nakai's affectionate first name-based relationship with Jung. But it is notable that Nakai elaborated on Jung's specific help to explain his dedication of the name to a mere interpreter, ineligible for such dedication in botanical rules. Nakai did not use first names for any other Japanese. Jung quite deserved this naming because it was him who first noted the Dengang tree's classificatory significance. So, Jung appeared not to be fully satisfactory of this dedication. To ask Nakai in 1926 to be his interpreter, giving the Latin translation of his description of a new type of Dengang tree that he had found near Pyongyang. There were several distinctions, like clear lines on the branch, to claim a new species, though it was later combined with Abelia thayani. This may show Jung's confused understanding of classificatory categories, draw attention to two minute details. Yet Nakai fully approved and maintained two Dengang species too, as Jung just inherited Nakai's splitter tendency of making new classificatory units based on small details. Yet Jung went on to make his own rules for classification, working with other Korean botanists from the 1930s, who were educated in modest colonial institutes and worked mostly as teachers in elementary and middle schools privately funded by Koreans. They met over 100 times to examine duplicate copies of specimens of Korean plants whose originals were at Nakai's Tokyo lab. While learning Nakai's criteria method, they connected the scientific names with their denigrated culture by establishing standard vernacular names for Korean plants in 1937. While they could not and did not refute Nakai's classification, Jung came to distance himself from Nakai's rules. Working as a forester under Ishidoya, Jung deeply knew the close relationship between plants and the local soil and environment. He made hundreds of Nakai's names synonyms to already known species in his 1943 work, if they did not maintain the distinctive characteristics when transplanted in different environmental conditions. The final renaming to examine is another lineage naming. It is a most successful naming of Linne, and that it was still used as Linne named, unlike many other names of it that have been discarded and changed. Was Linne exceptionally scientific or judicious about this naming? Linne named this tree, then unknown to Europeans, as Ginkgo biloba. Unlike other scientific names, it sounds familiar to those of us who work on East Asia, as Ginkgo is a Japanese name for the tree, though a more common name in Japan could have been Icho, and the spelling is a bit off. The second part of the name, biloba, described the bifurcated shape of the leaves. It was something new to Linne. While the fan shape of ginkgo leaves is indeed singular, Linne was not fully correct about this characteristic. As Jung noted, plants change the shapes of their parts in various ways depending on their growth cycle, season, and habitat. Even a single tree can have leaves of various shapes, as shown by the leaves of this Korean Dendropanax. Ginkgo leaves also come in a variety of shapes, the most common being the rounded shape on the right. Linne named it biloba, since he first learned about this tree from Engelbert Kemper, who introduced this unique tree to the European audience in 1712 through his work, The Life of the Exotic. It is an outcome of his stay in the Dutch trade house in Decima during 1690 to 1692. As you can see, Kemper's illustration only shows bifurcated leaves. It was not that Linne recklessly named it only with this one specimen, but all the dried and alive specimens that he remotely collected did not unsettle the initial impression. Some have called dried specimens immutable mobiles, relocating nature as it is to imperial centers. The hub area where Linne or Nakai resided thus became centers of calculation that could create universal rules to classify nature across geographical or political boundaries. Yet as nothing in nature, even plants rooted in one place, stay the same in their eventful, dynamic, and rich lives as ours, rules based on immutable mobile seem always vulnerable. Jung who saw numerous ginkgo trees in the field, produced this drawing with much rounded leaves for ginkgo biloba in his 1943 work. The ginkgo tree is called living fossil. It lived on Earth for more than 2 million years. It had a great crisis over the great ice ages and survived only in southeastern part of today's China. This survived one seems a remarkable creature, strong against bacteria, insects, pollution, and quite extreme heat and coldness, to live over 1,000 years. Chinese people noticed and admired these qualities to use its parts for food and medicine, and criticized about its virtue, which made it known to outside China like Korea and Japan. They naturally coveted this tree to transplant it to their land one by one, with the Chinese name Inxing, though Korean pronounce it as Eunhaeng, Japan ginkgo. What is the science of Linné's scientific name of ginkgo? Was it his Europeanization, like Korean Koreanization of Eunhaeng and Japanese Japanization of ginkgo? What civilization contributed to this naming? Is it just a Western, modern, and scientific one? Of course, ginkgo biloba hardly represents the whole systematics. But if these botanists accepted such naming as just Western modern science, what was their reasoning? Was it the exceptional clarity, precision, objectivity of Linnean rules? Or was it also the wish to be one of the civilized, enlightened, and modern? Exposing the imperfection of Western modern science is not the aim of this book. Like any man-made system, science progresses upon its imperfection. Rather, science-made imperfection is strength, guided by the Baconian method of induction that requires constant progress or adjustment by new facts and discovery. This book is more about how we came to perceive such imperfect systems as the unchanging authority dubbed Western modern science. It presents not some Western players like Linné, but these Japanese and Koreans who called themselves botanists as main actors, who promoted this imperfect system, whose weakness that they knew well as a kind of final destination for all cultures. As many in the field have already pointed out, it was these contact zones like Japanese Colonial Korea where Western modern science was thus actualized as an unquestionable authority. This globalization, rather than equalizing all participants for their equally significant contributions, seems to have been pushed by hierarchical divisions such as the West and the West, the center and the periphery, the imperial and the colonized, the modern and the traditional, and so on. Our ginkgo biloba L shows certain malfunctioning of these divisions too. According to the International Union for Conservation of Nature, it is the first-rate endangered species. The map of its distribution from the Kew Gardens marks its territory, violet for the cultivated ginkgo and green for the precious natural one. But what do you think? How natural would be those one in Southeast Asia, and how artificial those one in the 18th century Japan, drawn in Kemper's book and named by Linné? And aren't you questioning yourself? Why my town, which has some beautiful ginkgo trees, is not marked in violet, as ginkgo trees indeed live in all the continents these days, like this one in Paris. Apparently, urban landscapers who transplanted these resilient trees to their streets and parks are too busy to report for the Kew database or they have no account in the database for pure botanists. Are we going to save the ginkgo tree by this divided information? Or what would this strong tree that have lived on this earth about 50 times longer than us think about this? I think we have enough people on this globe who have wanted to recombine our knowledge and practice to make this earth less dangerous for all. Yet, the most enduring and successful naming of Linné that these model students of modernity in Japanese colonial Korea embraced as Western modern science fails at this task of combining divided efforts. I think how we may rename this knowledge practice that we have created and sustained together. I wish to hear your suggestions and comments for all these new names. Thank you very much for your attention and participation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Lee. We'll now turn the time over to Professor Miller for some comments.
Hi, everybody. Can everyone hear me? Maybe some thumbs up to make sure that we're all connected well. I see folks from South Korea, of course, New Zealand, Singapore, the UK, and scenic Indiana, if I've got everything right. So just hello to old friends, and nice to meet you to new friends. I myself am just back from the D. Kim Foundation conference at KAIST in South Korea. The jet lag has been pretty tough, and I apologize if I'm a little daft. I'm going to blame it on the time difference as opposed to just age. But I left that conference really excited about precisely the issues that I'm really going to foreground in my comments on Professor Lee's marvelous book, which is the vibrancy of science and technology studies, histories of science, technology, and medicine, as well as to a certain degree the environment that we're seeing right now. And in particular, I think in South Korea, if I'm honest, it is really a remarkable corner, or rather center, of our discipline and our practice. And I left just really excited about the future. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I want to start by formally by saying thank you to Joseph Seeley and the Modern Japanese History Association for making this event possible. The MJHA has become remarkably vibrant, remarkably quickly. And I'm really grateful to the organizers and facilitators who make that possible. Thank you. I also want to thank you, Professor Lee, for this excellent book. You've shown us that the history of botany is crucial to any attempt to understand the development of modern science and the scientific disciplines in East Asia. I was delighted to see this title of the book before we were in touch. I was even more delighted when I began to read. And so, in the spirit of being a good respondent, I'm going to give you two critiques right up front. These are my only two main critiques. But here are my substantial criticisms of the book. The first is that the title does not perhaps do the book justice. So for those of you who haven't picked it up yet, this is a book about more and something other than renaming plants and nations. It indeed, I think I might have retitled it something really boring, but I'm bad at titles. The co-production of botany in imperial Japan and colonial Korea would be my nominee, but perhaps it's because I'm colleagues with Sheila Jasanoff, who coined the co-production framework and term. My second critique of this very strong book is that it's just too short. And so some of my, I'm going to have three questions for you, Professor Lee. You can take them as they come or at the close, but one of them at least just is asking for more detail, and I think really two of them are. In a field where many of our books are at times bloated or overly long, this is a book that is far too lean. It could have used 50,000 words or more additionally. So this book was, as I suggested, not what I expected when I agreed to comment. I knew Professor Lee and her work because she does such cool work in material studies and histories of science and practices of science and STS. I'm not sure what I expected exactly when I took things on. But what I didn't forecast was the thing that has impressed me the most as someone who knows something, if not a great deal, about the history of science in Meiji Japan in particular. The first two chapters of this book offer truly excellent introductions to an analysis of the development of the science of botany in Japan itself. And that, for this group, since we're the MJHA, that's worth the price of admission. Look at those chapters. They may take your time. They may ask you to slow down as you read a little bit, but they are finely wrought histories of the development of a crucial scientific discipline. These two chapters are rigorous in their engagement with the historiography in Japanese, but also in their key reading of important works by botanists, collectors, and scientists who drove the transformation and formation of what we now call the natural sciences in Japan. I revel in this book's hard, grounded, and specific rejection of the stale diffusionist arguments that shaped so much of the previous generation's work in the history of science. For those of you not in the history of science subfield, or if this is new, it is what it sounds like. The diffusionist argument is the history of science version of the notion that modernity begins in Euro-America and in Western Europe in particular, and diffuses to the antipodes and so on. Professor Lee's rebuttal to that model is strong and grounded in the material in a way that is salutary. And I just want to underline what Professor Lee has done here. She's shifted our attention from discourse about science, which for those of us who've read the previous generation of work in Japanese on the history of science, right? Which is where I cut my teeth in this field. There, the focus is on the discourse of science, kagaku as such. Focusing more, it's nominalist. It's focusing on language as opposed to the practice of science. And Professor Lee takes us into the practice of science. And we immediately thus perceive deep continuities out of the rich Tokugawa era practices of Honzo-gaku and so on that we've learned about with Federico Marcone's work and elsewhere. And that's just so visually vibrant, but also crucially scientifically formative. And we also learn about the crucial role played by East Asian actors in producing or co-producing the Euro-American science that wished to claim itself as originary and always already prior. And so those chapters, that alone is worth the price of admission, y'all, because you begin to get into this dynamic that you may sense instinctively is wrong-headed because it resonates with other parts of our field. But here we see through the practice of botany how this older framework is simply insufficient to understanding the complexity of the dynamics at play. So that's kind of my opening kind of thoughts on the text. When I step back and think about the broader context and significance of Professor Lee's book, I'm heartened by what it tells us. This book marks for me three really big and perhaps somewhat obvious dynamics in our field, which nonetheless merit mention here. First, the history of science is flourishing in East Asian studies in general and Japanese history in particular. We're beginning to see this in sociological terms within the discipline, as some of the folks who are on this call, for example, are moving into positions in history of science, technology, medicine specifically. That is not someone like me who began as a Japan historian and quickly realized there's this segment of the world that was not being addressed by enough folks. But folks who are coming up within the discipline and speaking to its core concerns. I'm old enough to recall a time not that long ago when James Bartholomew's seminal work stood as a somewhat lonely kind of marker on the intellectual landscape of Japanese history in English. And so here we're seeing increasing numbers, and this book is emblematic of that turn. Second, and crucially, Professor Lee's fine book illustrates a long developing cosmopolitanism within the history of science and related areas in general. Not for nothing, this is a book that comes to us from South Korea, is published via the UK, and we're talking about it in a transnational setting right now. That's really critical, and it speaks to transformations that those of us in the core of the Japan history discipline may not be perceiving. East Asia has not just moved to kind of a polite inclusion in some of the core institutions in the history of science and history of technology, but East Asia-based scholars and East Asianists are now leading the History of Science Society, the Society for the History of Technology, and so on. So this book is a part of that vibrant cosmopolitanism and a deprovincializing that Professor Lee, in fact, talks about in different ways at a different time, and I think is actually participating, in a sense, in that same history. Third, very obviously, this book, like much of the best work from folks like Joseph and others in the field, is multilingual and multinational. And, you know, some of you on the call have heard me talk about this. Simply reading and speaking another language doesn't mean much in a world where many people do this. But using those languages to show something important that you otherwise may not be able to perceive that's the whole ballgame. And the book here does that really finely by describing the asymmetries in Japanese and Korean language archives that echo historical asymmetries in the practice of science itself. We're able to watch Korea-based scholars and practitioners and teachers track back and forth between linguistic registers strategically. Likewise, we're able to see leaders in Japanese science, such as Nakai Takenoshin. And Nakai, for those of you who don't know about, this is a really important figure, not just in Japan and East Asia, but globally in the history of botany. Becomes the honorary chair of major conferences in Stockholm and elsewhere. And Nakai himself, we find him in Professor Lee's pages, tacking back and forth between Japanese and English, and as he attempted to negotiate his claims on and assertions of authority and expertise within different spheres. And it's really great. It's quite illuminating to watch that happen. And so that multilingual thing comes into full flowering here. So I'm going to move into kind of paragraphs that lead to questions, Professor Lee. And here's the first one. You offer us the sort of nuanced, detailed analysis of the development and, as I've suggested, practice of botany in Meiji Japan that I would love to see in other areas within the history of science and within the Japanese Empire. Your focus on the praxis of science is really salutary, and we meet several truly crucial figures that have been overlooked in English, and I would suggest overlooked in Japanese language work, at least when I last looked at all these folks and this literature. I'm especially excited to see Ishidoya Tsutomu and Hayata Bunzo brought forward here. Two leaders in what you call Japan's botanical modernization. Mm-hmm. And I want to single out the subtlety of the ways you deal with Hayata's work in particular. And again, for those here who haven't read the book, go to this section. I love the stuff on renaming the ginkgo and the sakura. That's really interesting, but the Hayata stuff is really crucial. This portion of the manuscript is the closest we get to something like a traditional internalist treatment of the history of the science itself. And within the history of science, internalist approaches are, as they suggest, internal to the praxis and practice of a particular scientific discipline. And here we get down quite literally into the kind of nitty-gritty of the field and the tensions between Nakai's focus on dry specimens and Hayata's richly realized theory of life as he struggles with the limitations of Nakai's worldview and those emanating out of that arrogant Euro-American tradition. He's an absolutely fascinating figure who passed away too quickly. He's on par, for those who might know the field in other ways, with someone like Minakata Kumagusu, but for my money, actually more interesting and far less obscure than Minakata, who I love, by the way. I mean, slime mold is fascinating, as is Minakata, even in his rampant misogyny. You know, Hayata is equally interesting and perhaps more rigorous scientifically. He's important here because of the way Professor Lee reads him and his work. He was often dismissed by historians of science in Japan because of his idiosyncrasy and, like Minakata, his ardent Buddhism. Lee reads Hayata, as I think we should, as an iconoclast willing to critique not only the strictures of binding and emerging and limiting modern science, but also, to a limited degree, the cruel dynamics of Japanese colonization. And that's for maybe why he's more interesting to the broader modern Japan audience. Crucially, for those who don't practice history of science or don't know Hayata, he was a strong critic and an explicit critic of Spencerian ideas that weaponized the functions of natural selection in support of assertions of racial superiority. He is speaking back to that moment in a way that we all wish others may have, and perhaps in the present moment still would. You know, he's not a perfect figure, however. He may have been beholden to something like his own version of a green Orientalism in his rather utopian depictions of life in Pacific Islands and so on. But what's crucial here is that Jung, you show us through his science practice as a botanist how this functioned, how he did this and how this came to light for him and how he struggled with these dynamics. So this leads me to the first of my three questions, at which I can tell him already I'm going to have to accelerate. I'm struck and heartened by your readings of Hayata and someone like Ishidoya Tsutomu as critics of the colonial setting and culture within which they were working. Mm-hmm. And I'm eager to hear you speak explicitly and more about the limits of their resistance to the limits of those critiques of colonization. And if you are able to, as fully as possible, I'd love to hear how that came through in their practice, in the practice of forestry or botany, their practice as professional scientists. So I can offer that question now and we can move to another one next, or I can move to the following two if you wish, Professor Lee. What would you prefer? And Joseph, of course, you're welcome to chime in.
Yeah. I'm okay with any way.
I think just in the interest of making sure we give the audience time to ask questions, maybe it'd be good for you to
move to the other two,
and then let Professor Lee respond to whatever she wants to respond to.
Absolutely. So here's the next, slightly shorter, and the last is just the question. Another contribution from this text is Professor Lee's admirable work to shift our attention to the small scale but crucially important development of Korea or Korean-based botany. The book is incisive when it urges us at various points to shift our study of science from the pages of journals or the self-conscious assertions of scientific practice as a discipline or set of disciplines to the facts of practice, collection, and more generally doing science. Professor Lee talks about Korean botanists as, quote, doers, unquote. And this is something that I love. I love when historical actors generate theory. And here, as I understand it, Professor Lee, you're drawing on the discourse of colonial era Korean educated elites, some of whom you show critiqued exhibitions such as those I and Joseph have both written about, zoological gardens and others. They were critiquing them as converting Korean attenders into gawking, simply gawking at the splendor of imperial Japanese scientific accomplishment. They perceived this as a key element of those exhibitions and expos. They urged their fellow countrymen to move from simple observation, thus, to fieldwork, and you spoke to this in your presentation to us, to practice, from gawking to collecting, from spectacle to identifying specimens. And this gets to my question, which is really an archival question. I'm eager to better understand how you think about this focus on practice from a theoretical direction, but my main question is really material and archival. What does the archive of the doers of science look like? In the book, I don't have a sense for these materials. I want to know how we perceive this other than through discourse. How did it unfold in practice? Do we have these materials? If so, what do they look like? And if they're still distributed across South Korea, as I imagine they might be, for younger scholars, this strikes me as a crucial collection practice. It may be that we need to be contributing in some fashion to gathering these ephemera together, because they are really clearly striking and important. So that's my second question, is what does the doer archive look like in South Korea? What does that colonial colonized archive look like? My final question is a really big one that I ask about every book or every author after they publish a book. And I'm not talking about, I don't want to ask you what you are doing next, Professor Lee, but I'm speaking to the change in sensibility that comes from each of us when we finish a book. Those of us who've been lucky enough to get one of these things done, we know what this is like. When you're done with it, you often perceive what is necessary for the field, what's new, what's next. And so I want to ask you, what new questions do you think we should be asking now that you've finished this book? I'll be honest, you've spoken to one of the things I saw coming out of the nature of the beast, and you actually spoke to it in your intro to this. You perceive that those hints in the book itself. As I was writing that, the history of zoology, Tanaka Shigeo, and that whole lineage that you have helped to explicate was visible to me as something that had to be studied, as crucial. It wasn't there in English, right? And you've come along and made a strong, I mean, I love zoology. Animals would have been great, but you've proven to me that botany is more important. So that would have been my version at this stage, all those years ago when I finished The Nature of the Beast. I'm curious, what are you looking at as you move through this history of intensely mediated science to help us kind of think as scholars about where we might direct our own attention? So those are my three questions, and thank you very much. You can take them or leave them as you wish.
Thank you so much. May I respond quickly? Yeah. Thank you so much for those, incredibly kind and insightful comments and questions. Your reading is so kind, and that I'm not sure whether I did all those wonderful things, but I think I don't know what to which questions I want to take up. I want to answer your first important question and about Hayata and Sutomu and their limitations. I think I've been thinking about this like forever because I also love their critics on this, the usual imposition or acceptance of the imperially imposed scientific practice and the belief of our people and everything. But yeah, as you already suggested, it is really kind of the very common, well-known, well-critiqued banality of kind of evil thing that as a person who needed this profession to get their living, I think they could not fully live the kind of the imperially provided professional network in a sense. So Ishidoya left colonial Korea to Beijing, but his expansion to to the Chinese traditional medicines in Beijing also could not fully free from this imperial, support for his scientific practice and all those asymmetric relations that this imperial power imposed on that new context zone for this aspiring and I don't know what to say. Creative mind too. But I think deeply not doubt. I think I always think, what could I have done if I were in their positions? And I don't think I could done much better or much more courageously than they did in just producing this kind of critics, but going on as a practitioner privileged by this imperial power structure in a sense. And I think Hayata was a bit different than Ishidoya Tsutomu because he really, as someone who had really developed religious faith, I think, so he was more courageous, and that's why he was more actively kind of suppressed his voices, as I discussed in the book. Nakai tried to suppress him as this idiosyncratic figure whose critics should not be taken into serious consideration by other Japanese botanists. So I think that, and he died too young. So I think he was someone whom I want to learn more about and want to kind of introduce more to the audience. And I thank you very much for mentioning their unique attempt, whether they have limitations or not. And second, the doers archive of doers, I think it could be mainly for the phonologists, if it's the right term. I think for those, I'm kind of in between Japanologists and Koreanists, right? And for those who have been mainly doing Japanese history, could use the Korean language archives more effectively if they want to discover this kind of daring voices of Koreans. Oh, we are not just spectators who would be impressed by this, right? The imperial display of their modernity. We know their tactics, right? We won't be like dragged into these exhibitions showing our wonders. We will be the doers. So it is, in their situations, were quite daring critics on all the attempts of the imperial players. But in Korean, I think it worked for them too. It's not just the brave, or they are uniquely critical-minded human beings than just regular Japanese. They are just Koreans and making this kind of nationalist rhetoric worked for them. Yeah, with that kind of nationalist rhetoric, they could build their modest institutes, even though it's not considered the full developed scientific institute. They could secure their professions and those modest elementary and course, and they were called botanists. People cheered for them to become the scholars and botanists. So I think it worked for them. And then you can use the Korean archives. It is also wonderful that most of colonial period works are online. So if anyone wants to learn more about how to navigate these things, yeah, I can give some help. About the big question, I promise, because Ian kindly tipped about this plan to ask this big question beforehand, but I thought it's about what I will do next, and then I didn't think what's next for the field very deeply. But I think so. I will just kind of escape the question. In a sense, it's bad to escape that big question, but I think it's what you have been doing, Ian, and you have been doing. So, and all of us, all the colleagues in the field have been thinking about this for a long time, have been pushing towards the more definite, for the more definite transformation of our understandings and our approaches to this topic of science, technology, environment, and modernity, and the history itself. So I think I will just try to join all that's going on in the field and try to chip in. So thank you for all really wonderful, incredibly kind questions and suggestions.